After 40 years as a full-time peace worker, I should know what peace is, but actually I'm not so sure. I make it my business to try to win others over to seeing the value of peace and working to promote it. To some extent, my success rate is determined by what they think the word peace means. Let me contrast here two different notions of peace and say why people prefer one over the other. Peaceableness is a continuum or spectrum, and we set a cutting point someplace along that spectrum to distinguish peace from non-peace. At one end of the continuum is warfare. War is organized violence to gain control over decision-making structures. The other end would be something like Barry's poem or the 23rd Psalm, a state of blissful indolence. You can set your cutting point at the war end so that peace just means the absence of war, nothing more. But then your definition of peace will include a lot of unpeaceable things, such as crime, exploitation, and poverty. The only thing you'll exclude is organized violence for political ends. Nevertheless, we do use that definition when we contrast peacetime from wartime, and I use it when trying to persuade others to oppose war. After all, most people already claim to believe in peace in that sense, even if they're actually supporting every war that seems to come along. They're more skeptical about the alternative notion of peace, where you set the cutting point far toward Barry's end of the continuum. In my experience, this notion of peace doesn't win over many converts, and I think I know why. Barry's poem describes peace as still, calm, motionless. So are the hymns today. It's a place in nature where one can rest. Ease and effortlessness are the defining quality. Also, he mentions wild things that are not worrying about their future, since nature guides their behavior without any moral deliberation on their part. This notion of peace means more than the absence of war. It means even the absence of conflict, both inner conflicts about right and wrong, and conflicts between incompatible individuals or groups. Poetry often evokes this sense of tranquility in us by describing convivial animals in a verdant wilderness. And indeed, the absence of moral quandaries is an attractive aspect of peace. And that's why people, poets anyway, refer to nature as peaceful. For in nature, a predatory animal isn't a malevolent murderer. His victim is simply his breakfast. But this notion of peace can suggest that maybe peaceful human beings should also act spontaneously without guilt. In real life, any such unconscientious person is considered an impulsive sociopath. Normal people aren't like that, thank goodness. And in fact, this notion of nature as peaceful makes for good poetry, but it's not even realistic in depicting nature. Take this matter of ease, for example. While we're lying down resting on that green pasture, those wild things around us are working strenuously. The earthworms under us are not at ease. 1 hectare of soil contains over 500,000 of them, and in a year, they turn over 36 tons of soil. And yes, that great heron is feeding calmly, but on a fish that does not consider the experience very peaceful. In short, the seemingly peaceful scenes in nature actually are sites of strenuous struggle and agony. But my real objection to this version of peace is its dulling effect on human motivation. Even if peace were really this easy and comfortable, it would be unbearably boring. This is the kind of peace that you rest in when you're dead, R.I.P. And when you're alive, you want more action. At least I do, and I hope you do too. And action involves conflict and struggle. If your definition excludes conflict, you're asking for tedium. You can't be a hero in such a peaceful setting, for a hero risks his own well-being for the sake of others. Whereas in this version of peace, danger and struggle are absent. Conflict is what makes life interesting and worth living. though it certainly doesn't have to be violent conflict. I get my kicks from following intellectual debates in other people's research fields and rooting for one side to defeat the other, even if I don't know much about the details. You may get your thrills from following the price of Bitcoins or Tesla on the stock exchange. I don't know. Sure, you do want to rest occasionally, but you don't want to rest all the time. And sometimes you want to test your own strength in an agonistic competition. At least young males do, and sometimes even old women. I do, and you can't blame that on testosterone. I taught peace studies for decades to university students, and almost none of them became peace activists. I think mainly because peace is usually depicted as an anodyne commitment. They wouldn't be caught dead wearing buttons with pictures of doves, but lots of them wore t-shirts with pictures of Che Guevara. None of them joined his revolution, but then none of them joined my movement either. I couldn't convince them that peace activism is a scary, dangerous commitment because it really isn't. It's hard to find tough projects that many peace activists can do. Yes, if my students had been physicians, they could have joined Doctors Without Borders in the Congo, say, but they were undergraduates. So I just told them to take up rock climbing. Rock climbing, soccer, and maybe even ping pong can somewhat appease the craving for edginess, but sports cannot fulfill the deeper urge to sacrifice oneself for the greater good. Warfare does so. We still pin medals on soldiers for killing because they did it not for personal gain, but as a disciplined display of loyalty to the nation, whether wise or misguided. Later, these acclaimed heroes may feel remorse, and let's pray for those who do, for guilt is a more honorable attitude than triumphalism. 8 times more veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan have later committed suicide than were killed in battle. Yet society still praises valor. Our gratitude toward killers began before history. Cavemen presumably stationed their strongest youths at the cave entrance to protect them from enemies and tigers. There's no similar role today for peace activists, but the motivation for it remains alive. Few victorious warriors probably ever really do feel remorse. I have a Karen friend whose brother was killed by the Burmese army. So he joined the Karen army in the jungle and served 17 years as a sniper. One night at my dinner table, he told me about his old feelings. He had killed dozens, maybe 100 enemy soldiers, and each time was a great thrill. He couldn't sleep afterward because he was so elated. That's what he'd come to do, and he'd succeeded. Today, he still doesn't feel guilt, but recounts those memories as if they baffle him. But it's easy to understand him. Everyone has that potential, peace workers too. William James addressed this issue in a 1908 lecture at Stanford University titled "The Moral Equivalent of War." In it, he declares that he belongs to the anti-militarist party, but his description of hawkish ideology is more favorable than negative. Clearly, he thinks they have a valid point. Militarism, he declared, quote, is the great preserver of our ideals of hardihood, and human life with no use for hardihood would be contemptible. Without risks or prizes for the darer, history would be insipid indeed, close quote. Many of James's comments will outrage feminists. He seems to love the word manliness. He insists that, quote, martial virtues must be the enduring cement, contempt of softness, surrender of private interest, obedience to command must still remain the rock upon which states are built, close quote. Well, maybe, but there are other forms of courage too, and some of them deserve greater respect than manly obedience to authority. I personally feel deeper admiration for men or people whose integrity keeps them aloof from groupthink or patriotic jingoism, and some of them are female, but that's off the topic. Anyway, James's article does acknowledge certain important facts about human nature that peace workers tend to ignore at our peril. We should usually set the cutting point closer to the war end than Barry's end. Peace always does, and I hope it always will, include conflict and problems, for our assignment in life is to solve problems. Lucky is the person with the freedom to select her own problems and who's smart enough to pick juicy ones. Fortunately, even if young people today display little interest in peace, they certainly do have an interest in global warming and other environmental threats, such as plastic. And James suggested an innovation that might even be useful today. He thought that kids from prosperous families needed more exposure to life's tough challenges and should be drafted into an army in which all social classes would toil together in a disciplined way for the national interest. So he proposed, quote, instead of military conscription, a conscription of the whole youthful population to form, for a certain number of years, a part of the army enlisted against nature. This will enable our gilded youth to get the childishness knocked out of them and to come back into society with healthier sympathies and soberer ideas. They would have paid their blood tax, done their own part in the immemorial human warfare against nature. They would tread the earth more proudly, close quote. Yeah, you heard me right. James said against nature. In 1908, people still believed that their mission on this planet was to subdue nature. We now know what that idea has led us to. But otherwise, his proposal may have some merit. Youths do still want to test their strength in extremely demanding situations, though today it's by protecting nature and not subduing it. How can any youthful individual become a hero in a noble cause today? There are not many opportunities to do anything for the climate that requires danger or self-sacrifice. Greta Thunberg crossed the Atlantic by sailboat to avoid emitting carbon, but not many people can do that. Youths do march together with placards, but unfortunately that doesn't build up their hardiness. Maybe we could create work camps for tree planters. Today, there are 3 trillion trees on the planet, and we need 1 trillion more. A trillion is 1,000 billions. Canada has offered to plant 2 billion. That leaves us with 998 billion more to go. And then the trees have to be watered and weeded for a couple of years. Such an assignment is not as dangerous as fighting in trenches, but it's more fulfilling than rock climbing. And it would do wonders for the manliness and even the womanliness of our youth. Thanks, William James, for a great proposal. And thanks, Wendell Berry, for a great poem.